We've done our quarterback and running back offseason previews. Now it is time for wide receivers. There are some big name free agents, some big trade candidates, but the biggest thing that we're looking at are some big name players who could potentially get released this offseason and added to the free agency pool. As always, joined today with Jeff Bell. And Jeff, I don't think you could do a wide receiver free agent offseason preview type of episode without talking about George Pickens. So let's start there. We know that they opened up some money by moving off of Micah Parsons. It sounds like the Dallas Cowboys want to give George Pickens a long-term contract, but based off the end-of-season finish here, we could potentially be looking at a franchise tag. What are you making of George Pickens? Do you think he is a Dallas Cowboy next year? And do you think that's on a one-year deal or a multi-year deal, if so?
Well, I absolutely think he's going to be a Dallas Cowboy. He's too valuable to probably not be a Dallas Cowboy. I mean, they could potentially dangle him out there and see if somebody would get aggressive for it. But the very reasons why you wouldn't want to potentially give him a long-term deal are the reasons why somebody wouldn't want to get aggressive to go trade for him. As terms in what's going to happen is they're probably going to franchise him, and then they'll wait until the very last minute, and then they'll give him a contract because that's how Jerry Jones works. So wait until the market gets as hot as it can be and the value goes up. Wait till all these guys that are extension eligible sign, and then go out and sign George Pickens. That's basically what I fully expect to happen here. But I think that he will remain in Dallas. It seems like a strong relationship with CeeDee Lamb coming in and being positive. I mean, you're exactly right. And where we were thinking maybe like mid-November towards the end of November relative to where the season ended, definitely fell off a little bit on production towards the end of the year. But I think he was dealing with an injury. He talked about it during Thanksgiving. I remember following that Chiefs game. He had a strong game against the Chiefs on Thanksgiving, but then talked about being injured in that game. And it seemed like after that, everything really kind of slowed down.
Yeah, and it looked like, when we were talking mid-season, we were just expecting them to open up the bag, give George Pickens $120 million, name your price, like we need you here. But then, yeah, you talk about some of the fall off in production, also some of the effort. That was a big thing we heard about when he was in Pittsburgh, lack of effort. And we saw him giving up on some routes, not playing at 100%. And like you said, kind of blamed it on the injury, but we'll be watching that closely. Of course, the fear here with George Pickens and getting like way ahead of myself here, we do see often these young players when they get franchise tag, they just say, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to play on this franchise tag. I'm not coming to camp, not doing anything like that. And that's something that I am starting to pay a little bit more attention to, because oftentimes what we see is these players, even if they do hold out and then sign at the last minute, which is very much so in the Cowboys playbook. We saw this with Dak Prescott. We've seen this with other players as well, where they wait till the very end of camp to sign these guys. Those players aren't conditioned as good as they should be. They don't get calloused up in training camp. And we saw it just last year with Terry McLaurin. So I don't want to sound the alarms on a hypothetical situation, but if we do get to that point where there is some sort of holdout and he starts missing camp, it's one of those where like every week I'm just going to start knocking him down little by little, because there is fear and increased risk that he ends up picking up an injury.
Yeah, and I remember that's a conversation you and I had. We didn't have it online, we had it offline, but when we were kind of finalizing our rankings, not before last year, but the year before, the 2024 season leading into that, we were talking about just concern about some of these players that had been out. And I remember, I believe Brandon Ayuk was one of those players. I think Tyreek Hill was one of those players, and they definitely didn't deliver on where the ADP was sitting at the time. And I think it is probably good practice now to fade those players, because it seems more often than not, we do get the Terry McLaurin type season.
So let's keep moving down the list. We're talking about some of these young free agents that we expect to get paid. And Alec Pierce is next up in that list. Now, we talked about Alec Pierce a few weeks ago on this show and kind of looked at the potential situation here in Indianapolis. I'm going to jump ahead. We're going to talk about some of the potential releases later, but just a little peek there. When you look at Michael Pittman's contract, it is very much so structured that they can get out of his deal if they so choose. He's owed $29 million next year, but if they release him, they only have to eat $5 million in dead cap, so $24 million in potential cap savings. And when I look at that, them releasing Michael Pittman, letting him hit the open market, and then reallocating that money to Alec Pierce, in my opinion, just makes so much more sense.
To be clear, I think that Michael Pittman is too valuable to just flat out release. I think that Michael Pittman would be traded. I think that definitely a team would go out there and get him. The problem with Michael Pittman on the Colts is that you've got Tyler Warren and Josh Downs, and you've turned into just duplication in players that operate in similar areas of the field. Alec Pierce is the person that we're actually talking about here. And Alec Pierce is so underrated by everybody that he's properly rated. He seems to be the guy that literally everyone is saying Alec Pierce is really underrated, to the point where I think that he's very, very properly rated now at this point. I think we've all kind of recognized that Alec Pierce is going to be in a position to get a very lucrative contract here. And whether I wouldn't expect he gets to free agency, I think the Colts are going to sign him, but he really stepped up as the Colts kind of the go-to receiver in many aspects, or at the very minimum, they need him with Tyler Warren, where you can kind of play that high-low game. You can have Tyler Warren attacking underneath, and then having Alec Pierce in the vertical game, because he's one of the very best players, I think, over the last 2 years, has definitely led the league in yards per reception. Then Josh Downs kind of operates as more like that satellite receiver, runs those orbit routes underneath, and those three can work very well in tandem. It's that the overlap with Michael Pittman that you run into, and really the fantasy value that we saw of Michael Pittman was really touchdown dependency early in the season. That started to slow down a little bit, and you kind of ended up with more of a low end wide receiver 3 type, wide receiver 4 type that you weren't really sure what to do in your lineup.
And you talk so often about how good receivers just don't hit the market. These guys either get traded or retained by their team. And that because of that, when these guys do hit the market, they end up getting these very surprising contracts. And I think back to like Christian Kirk when he signed with Jacksonville a few years ago, people were flabbergasted at how much money he got. And then I look at Jacoby Myers when he signed with the Las Vegas Raiders, people couldn't believe the contract he got. And I think looking at Alec Pierce right now, whether he stays with Indianapolis or signs with a different team, 3 years, $65 million, 4 years, $80 million. Would something like that surprise you, Jeff?
No, it wouldn't surprise me at all. And that's what we mentioned, Jacoby Myers. And I remember after the trade to Jacksonville, he was re-signed, and it was the reactions on social media were at two ends of the spectrum, where you had a whole bunch of people saying, my God, Jacoby Myers got that much money. And then you kind of had maybe a little bit more plugged in people saying that was quite a deal that the Jaguars were able to sign for Jacoby Myers there. It's just that everybody needs ideally 2 wide receivers, if not maybe 3 wide receivers. They're a finite resource. They're really valuable in the grand scheme. And I really view it as there being 5 blue chip positions: quarterback, wide receiver, left tackle, and even right tackle, just because tackle in general we saw with the Chargers this year, and then edge rusher, and then cornerback are kind of the blue chip positions that as you look around the NFL. And when you've got one of these receivers, and Alec Pierce topped 1,000 yards this year, showcased himself to be a legitimate playmaker. And this wasn't, we've seen some of these players where like Nick Westbrook-Akine has had some of those seasons where just kind of ends up catching touchdowns or seems to be forgotten about. The defense was not forgetting about Alec Pierce as he was carving them up over the second half of the year, especially.
Let's move on to the next guy here, Wan'Dale Robinson. And this might be a surprising name to kind of be lumped into this top tier here, but this is still a young player coming off back-to-back highly productive years where he was just a target magnet. But what we saw in 2025 was a change in usage. He wasn't just operating near the line of scrimmage. He was playing outside and inside. He was running deep routes as well. We saw him get unlocked in a completely new way than we've seen historically when Russell Wilson was the quarterback there. So we've kind of had this idea that Wan'Dale Robinson is just this gadgety little guy who can do some end arounds and jet sweeps and screens and slants and whatnot. But if you actually look at what he did in Kentucky, he was a downfield receiver there. And now we're starting to see that in the NFL as well. So we talk about the surprising Alec Pierce contract. I feel like people have talked so much about how he's going to have this surprising contract that it's Wan'Dale Robinson who's going to be the real surprise, that when he gets paid, people are going to say, whoa, 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 how did Wan'Dale Robinson get $60 million?
Yeah, I mean, Alec Pierce is so underrated that he's properly rated to the point the Colts are not going to let him go. And I think you're exactly right. And there was even kind of very much feelings around the Giants that when Wan'Dale Robinson is going into week 18, that it was going to be his last game with the team. We know that they kept the GM around, Joe Schoen around, but then they went out and they got a new coach, obviously John Harbaugh coming in. And so that's going to be a big change. There's stories today about John Harbaugh going out and targeting every Raven possible. And we know Wan'Dale Robinson's not a Raven.
Including Todd Monken.
Including Todd Monken. But we know Malik Neighbors going to be back. And so hope we get a fully healthy Malik Neighbors season. I think maybe they'll have to go to the draft. And obviously they gave Darius Slayton a decent contract last year in free agency. And that's where I think Wan'Dale Robinson is going to shake free. He's going to land in free agency. He is going to be the Christian Kirk, like you mentioned, that player that everybody goes batty about the money that he's given, because as we're going to run through this list, there's not a lot of guys that even come close to Wan'Dale Robinson.
Right. And you talk about that big Darius Slayton contract, and that's why they probably can't afford to bring Wan'Dale back. And I was looking through, all of these recent big contracts, kind of wondering like how are these structured? Teams so often we see these like big gaudy numbers where we're like, why did that guy get a 4-year contract and then he's released after his first year? I was looking at the Darius Slayton one thinking like maybe they work something in there where they can get out of it. They can't. I mean, he's due $18 million this year. If they were to release him, they'd have to eat $17.5 million, $17.75 million in dead cap. So just no savings whatsoever. So they are kind of handcuffed to Darius Slayton at this point. We know Malik Neighbors is going to be back, like you said, as well. But Wan'Dale Robinson, do you have any ideas of where he might potentially sign? Like, he seems like one of those guys to me that could fit in so many different offenses because of his versatility. He can be a deep threat for a team that needs a deep threat. He can be that underneath target hog for a team that needs that. I think he was really pigeonholed into this role in New York, but I just keep going back to like what he did at college. To me, he is a much more versatile player than what we saw during his time there.
All right, Dave, if I were to ask you the top 3 teams with the most cap space in the league, give me 3 teams that you think have the most cap space. Chargers are 4th.
The Chargers are at top. They've got what, like 160 million to spend or something like that.
85 million.
All right. And then I forget the next 2 teams. Lay them on me.
Tennessee is number 1 with 100 million.
All right.
They really could use a wide receiver. The Raiders are next with 92 million, and then the Jets are next with 87 million. So if you're going to ask me, where's Wan'Dale Robinson going to land? I think that if you were to say the Titans, the Raiders, and the Jets, that's probably pretty good guess there between those 3 teams. The teams with the most money, the teams with massive needs at wide receiver, teams that we know for sure. Probably would know for sure with the Raiders, but definitely with the Titans. They've got a young quarterback that they're looking to support. The Jets might end up there as well, but that's a massive need in the market. And like we said, there's not a lot of options available. I think one of those 3, actually all 3 of those, could be decent landing spots for Wan'Dale Robinson, as much as I don't know that we'd love them for fantasy football.
So you talk about, the guys, the teams with good salary cap available. Seattle Seahawks are 5th in salary cap right now. How much of that money do you think is going to Rasheed Shaheed this offseason, another pending free agent here? I think the big concern, of course, is Clint Kubiak. We don't know where he's going to go, and we know that there are ties between Clint Kubiak and between Rasheed Shaheed, and I think that's why we saw that midseason trade. But now he hits the market as an unrestricted free agent. Of course, they are still in the playoffs right now. Opened up last week's game with that kick return touchdown. Just an explosive player who has really come on strong over the last couple of years. Do you expect Seattle to retain him? Do you think that he follows Clint Kubiak wherever he goes? Or do you think he's going to be one of those highly sought after free agents on the market?
Well, I think Seattle's going to try to retain him, but should he hit the market, I think he is one of those players that could command a pretty large salary. Where Kubiak is going to land, that's a major question. And I know that he was mentioned as potential head coach for the Buffalo Bills on that short list there. And talk about a team that needs a wide receiver. If they were to hire Clint Kubiak, then go out and
Clint Kubiak and Rasheed Shaheed go to Buffalo. They fixed that team right there. I think that it's as simple as that. Like, give Clint Kubiak and Rasheed Shaheed to Josh Allen, and the Buffalo Bills are playing with fire.
It would help things certainly a little bit to where they're standing right now. But just to throw one team out there, I do think that Seahawks like him. They're certainly happy with him. We saw him be a difference maker for the Seahawks. We know that return touchdown against the Rams and that big comeback a couple weeks ago. And that's the reason why we're recording this prior to the NFC Championship game. That's the reason why they are hosting the Rams in the NFC Championship game. And they were able to get a bye week because of Rasheed Shaheed's return touchdown. We saw him open that game against the 49ers this past weekend with a long touchdown there. So yeah, that explosion in special teams, but also we haven't really seen it as much in the offense with Seattle. And I think that speaks a little bit more probably to just the offensive structure in general, the way that they want to run the ball, the way that they kind of are able to control games versus him not having that ability. I think that ability is definitely very much there.
And I do wonder how much too, as we're kind of talking through this situation, they drafted Torrey Horton, who was great, like for what you'd expect to get from a day three player. You know, he was far exceeding those expectations, and he was their punt return and kick return guy and making these explosive plays on offense. And it was when he got hurt that they went out and traded for Rasheed Shaheed. So I think familiarity in Kubiak's offense that helped them kind of fill a hole that they lost to injury. So with Torrey Horton expected back next year, maybe Seattle doesn't push too hard to retain Rashid Shaheed. I don't want to just say that he's going to follow Clint Kubiak wherever he goes, but definitely plays his best football when he's with Kubiak. So we'll see how that one shakes out. The last guy in this list, though, Jeff, that I want to talk about might be a surprising name to some people, but I think he deserves to be lumped in with this group is Jaylen Coker, another day three pick who has stepped up and looked very, very good over the last 2 seasons. Another versatile player. We can see him play flanker. We can see him play as that big slot as well. We haven't seen him play much at X receiver because they've had that role covered since he's been there. But I do wonder if he has, a guy who's just continuously developed since he came into the league. He might have that ability to start beating press coverage and playing X receiver as well. So a big bodied, physical, athletic receiver who has just shown time and time again that he has reliable hands. This is another one that I think is going to surprise people, whether he's retained with Carolina or signs elsewhere. I think, a multi-year $40-50 million contract wouldn't be unheard of for Coker.
Well, you say it's going to surprise people, but we are speaking to the Dynasty audience here, and
Fair.
we're working
They
in the
love
rookie
Coker.
guide, and Jaylen Coker. Dynasty loves Jaylen Coker. Our loyal listeners and followers know that our rookie guide, Football Guys rookie guide, a couple seasons ago was very high on Jaylen Coker in the initial cut there. So I think that we're speaking to the exact audience that's going to say, "What are you talking about? We know we love Jaylen Coker. He's the dude." He is an exclusive rights free agent, so that kind of complicates things a little
Right.
bit in terms of what he might be able to go out and get in the market, or what might be around teams that because you do see these situations where players with those types of tags, teams don't want to sign them early because then the retaining team will basically let it sit for a couple of days and your money's tied up while everybody else is getting signed. And then the retaining team will just say, well, we're going to keep him now at this point. And so I think we've seen that the game move that direction a little bit here. And so I think he might be a little limited in the market, but I absolutely think that he stepped up over the second half of the season. We saw that big game against the Rams in the playoffs, really brings a lot as a compliment to Tedero McMillan, and seeing Tedero McMillan emerge as a rookie. We're kind of time to give it up a little bit on Xavier Legette on that really coming together. Maybe year 3, he can still break out. But I think that when you're looking at Tedero McMillan and knowing that he's cost controlled for the next 4 seasons, knowing that Bryce Young still has some levels of cost control with his contract, that's where maybe you can go out there and re-sign, make sure that you retain Jaylen Coker, because again, we've run through 5 guys already, and we're kind of Jaylen Coker's the next best guy, and we're already talking about Jaylen Coker 5 players deep.
Right. And that's just, a testament to how like you said, like talented young players don't hit the market all that often. But let's talk about some other guys that, maybe not the youngest players. And the reason we started with the young guys is because this is a dynasty show. And we know that people are just enamored by age in dynasty, but there's also a lot of role players that are veterans that are going to be hitting their third, fourth, some even hitting their fifth contracts at this point. So let's talk through some of these guys as well. Starting with Juwan Jennings. Juwan Jennings, another day 3 pick who has stepped up in a big way, and has just steadily looked better and better, peaking over the last couple of years here. Now, he dealt with a lot of injuries early in the season that marred his production, but as we saw late in the year and through the playoffs, and we saw in the playoffs last year as well, he could be that wide receiver 1 in that offense when called upon. Now, I don't know if he's a team that, or a player that a team wants to build around, saying like, yeah, Juwan Jennings is a guy that we want, but he knows that he can step up in small windows here and there. What do you do with a guy like Juwan Jennings? Like, do you think that he ends up going back to San Francisco, or is this a guy that could potentially find a role in another similar West Coast offense?
I think he's a guy that's going to get paid, to be honest. I do wonder. I mean, if San Francisco's moving off Brandon Ayuk, then they're probably very incentivized to bring Juwan Jennings back, because if they were to lose Ayuk and Jennings, then all of a sudden you're looking at Ricky Pearsall and what? And Ricky Pearsall, we know kind of questions around there, and obviously George Kittle having that Achilles injury. I mean, that's serious. That's pretty
Right.
severe on George Kittle, the age that he is at, coming off an Achilles there. You start to shave off some of these targets, and all of a sudden you go from one of the most talented skill rooms in the league to Ricky Pearsall and a whole bunch of hope in terms there. So I think that they would probably retain Jennings, but it does seem to me that maybe there's some, I don't know how to really say it. It's like hard feelings like between the two, but it definitely, I think Jennings is a guy that was laying it out there at certain times. And I think Jennings doesn't necessarily feel like he's been valued with the 49ers potentially.
Yeah, and I think he wanted that big payday a couple of years ago, and they just gave him a relatively small 2-year deal. 2 years, about $11 million, and I think that that might be where some of that comes from. So I think if he has a chance to go out there and the team is going to pay him more than San Francisco is willing to, like he's absolutely going to take that. But you do have to wonder at what point they're just going to open up the checkbook and try to bring him back, because he is a valuable part of this offense, and like you said, the other pieces there are aging. Um,
That
I
was
could
one
see
that, yeah, because coming off that Super Bowl, he was excellent in the Super Bowl. And that really surprised me that
he was a Super Bowl
nobody in
MVP
the
for the
market.
first 3 quarters, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and like that he hit the market and really nobody showed much of interest. That really surprised me.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about another former 49er, Debo Samuel, coming off of a good year relative to what he did the year before. It's crazy what happens when you're not battling pneumonia throughout the preseason and training camp, but getting up there in age. And we have talked about how he does wear down a little bit more than other wide receivers because of his physicality and just the way that he plays. He's out there seeking contact, and he gets touches between the tackles and things that not many other wide receivers are doing. Now, personally, I think that he was an amazing fit in Washington, and I think that they would be highly incentivized to bring him back if possible. I don't know how much of a market there'd be for a guy like Debo Samuel, just because he is such a unique player. You can't just pick him up and drop him in any offense. Like, he needs to have this kind of specialized role, and we saw him flourish in San Francisco for years, and we saw it with Washington as well. I think there's a handful of other teams that could make a Debo Samuel type player work, but my expectation is that he would return to Washington.
Yeah, I would think so as well. And we never really did get to see all the pieces together last year with obviously Jaden Daniels
Right.
in and out of the lineup, Terry McLaurin also in and out of the lineup. Debo Samuel did miss some time. We never got to see this fully operational, but you talk about what the market would be. We kind of have a strong idea what the market would be, where he was a free agent. And he wasn't a free agent, he was going to trade him. The 49ers were very, very explicit about Debo Samuel is very available. And we know that there's a strong relationship with Adam Peters in Washington, having a long history in San Francisco. It wasn't the type of thing where everybody was clamoring to go out and get Deebo Samuel. It was that tapped in, and we saw that come to fruition again the other way when Brian Robinson was traded from Washington to San Francisco. So it was one of those that we know. I know the guy. Like, I know that you need to move him. We could use another wide receiver, instead of kind of like everybody saying, "Hey, Deebo Samuel's available. Let's go out and get him." And so I think that probably portrays itself to him staying in Washington, or them figuring out a way to make that work. Because again, like George Kittle, Zach Ertz, is Zach Ertz going to be done? Is he going to? What's the future hold for Zach Ertz if Zach Ertz isn't involved there in Washington? As much as we want it to be Ben Sinnott, it didn't seem like that's Ben Sinnott's really a thing that's happening too much. So they kind of need that piece within their offensive scheme.
Let's go ahead and talk about the next guy that we've got on the list here, Jeff, Romeo Doubs. And this is one, like, when there's a player that you just can't possibly imagine in a different jersey. Like, I can't picture Romeo Doubs in anything besides a Green Bay jersey, but this is one of those players where I think there's a huge dissonance between how the fantasy and dynasty community feels about Romeo Doubs and then what he actually does on an NFL field. Like, he has very reliable hands. He is a big target that can be relied on near the red zone. And then he's also a fantastic blocker. It's like the things that he does when he isn't being targeted that make him a valuable player. To me, so similar to all of the things that they had in Alan Lazard and lost as he got a little bit older. So To me, we know that the Packers, it is just kind of in their DNA to draft, develop, and retain these players. So I would expect that Romeo Doubs probably comes back at some point. But do you think that there might be some interest around the league for a player like Romeo Doubs, a chain moving, blocking, hard nosed wide receiver?
I think Romeo Doubs is the most interesting player that we could talk about this episode, to be honest with you, because he was 25, so he's stepping into right in the prime of his career. And I think the reasons why talk about fantasy not really being in it, it just felt like he was always kind of capped around 800 yards, or the most you're going to get, and you never really got these big weeks. And I think that spoke as much to the offensive system in Green Bay, where if we ever did see big weeks, it's because of big splash
Three
plays
touchdowns.
that, yeah, Jaden Reed or Watson broke or something like that. Versus Romeo Doubs's game isn't tailored to that. Boy, to me, he definitely seems like a player that could handle a whole lot more volume than what he was getting. And so we talking about the Tennessee and the Raiders and the Jets,
Mhm.
kind of some of these teams that, man, I think that as we have already thrown out Wan'Dale Robinson as a guy that might get more money than people realize, boy, Romeo Doubs is the guy out there that I feel like could be day one signing. Oh my God, Romeo Doubs got this. And I think that teams see that as a player that's stepping into the prime of his career, that's been a really key piece of this Packers offense, but an offense that hasn't relied on any one player.
Let me throw a comp out there, and I don't know how you'd feel about this comp, but Romeo Doubs, Michael Pittman. In my opinion, like very similar players. They can do a lot of the same things. And we saw Michael Pittman in a crowded offense last year put up very similar production to what we have seen from Romeo Doubs throughout his career. But then you see what Michael Pittman did 2 years ago when they didn't have any other playmakers, and he 1,150 yards, 109 catches. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if Romeo Doubs is capable of that ceiling in a new offense. So I am absolutely picking up what you're putting down right now. I think that Romeo Doubs is one of the more underrated players out there. And when you look just at the numbers, there isn't a lot to get excited about, but I think that what he does as a full player, what he could do in a larger role, and for whatever reason, I thought he was 27 years old. When you said 25, I had to fact check that. Yeah, still just 25 years old. Like, this is a guy who could end up getting paid pretty handsomely this offseason. So again, let's try to like pull this back to Dynasty here. What's the most you'd be willing to give up for a player like Romeo Doubs? Do you think that's one of those where you can just float out like a third round pick and an injury away running back and probably get Romeo Doubs in return?
You know full well that this is exactly what I'm going to do when this episode ends. So
Right.
yeah, as we step into rookie fever a little bit before the radar is really kind of pinged on these free agents, yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth trying to throw like something like that at this young guy that you're ready to give up on, a third round pick, and go out and get Romeo Doubs. But
I
the
I bet you could give up Trey Benson, like straight up Trey Benson for Romeo Doubs in return.
I don't know if I want to go that direction. I don't know. I'm still a believer in Trey Benson, as
I
foolish as
wanna
I
be.
might be, but
And I'm just looking at
yeah,
like my
I hear you.
80% Trey Benson across all of my dynasty leagues, like a way to maybe get out of some of those. But yeah, that might be a little bit of an overpay, but
I know you're a Zach Charbonnet guy. We know that Zach Charbonnet tore his ACL. What what direction would you be leaning there on Zach Charbonnet with the torn ACL with Romeo Doubs? Like, where does the pick need to be going to be able to balance that out?
I mean, I'm just a sucker for Zach Charbonnet,
I
so
know you
I'd
are.
probably way more aggressive than the market would be. But yeah, I'd probably need like at least a second round pick in addition. Yeah, I still am carrying the torch for Zach Charbonnet.
The thing I love about Dubs though is the goal line slant doesn't work in the NFL except for Romeo Dubs. It's like he's like the only player that it works in the NFL,
And
and it
Romeo
works
Doubs and
every single
Devontae
time.
Adams, who were
Yes,
teammates for a while. Like maybe he learned a thing or two from Adams over
maybe he goes
that
to the
time together.
Rams.
Maybe. Which honestly, like you kind of like said that tongue in cheek, but like the Rams, they prioritize blocking receivers. That would make so much sense, especially if they could retain. We'll talk about Devontae Adams' contract a little bit later in the episode, but if they can retain Devontae Adams, bring Romeo Doubs there, kind of help him get up to speed. What I'm getting at, there are a lot of offenses that Romeo Doubs would fit into, just a player with his skill set. let's
Well,
keep
we
working down
see
here
Jeff
again. Yeah.
Hafley landing in Miami as the new coach there, Packers defense coordinator. And if they were to move off Tyreek Hill, I mean, maybe they go out and get Dubs, kind of step into that spot. So yeah, I think that there's spots.
Let's talk about some more other veterans here. Marquise Brown. How does it feel like Marquise Brown has been a free agent every offseason for the last like 6 years?
He
It feels
has
like we
been,
just
and
keep
nobody cares.
it just seems like we keep talking to every single offseason about what Marquise Brown is going to do. Like I was holding that torch for a long time, but you know, I think we know what he is at this point. He is a field stretching role player. If you draft him in your best ball leagues, you know, you could have that occasional 80 yards and a touchdown. But I think, you know, any hopes that Marquise Brown is going to develop into this one wide receiver one, I think we can kind of shelf those hopes at this point.
Yeah, and he's not even like the field stretcher anymore. It was almost the opposite this past year, where he was more like the what we all think Wan'Dale Robinson is, where it's the short to intermediate, really the short type target. We didn't
That
really
was
see the
when Worthy
explosion of
was
that.
sorry. That was when Worthy was hurt. They kind of put him into that role, but once Worthy came back, then Brown. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I felt like he went more into that like field stretching role over the second half of the season.
How many times do you think he had a reception of more than 21 yards? He caught 49
Mm,
passes last year.
I would
How
say
many
a
times did he go
reception.
over 21 yards?
I would say 4
One catch.
receptions and probably about all right. That checks. Yeah, yeah. Wait, you're
4
saying
times,
last year he
yeah.
had one?
Last year,
Uh,
he caught 49 total passes, and he
mhm,
only had 4 catches of over 21 yards.
yeah.
So, it's not good.
It's not at all. I'm trying to pull up the advanced numbers here, like the advanced game log, because, like I said, it felt like later in the year, like his role had kind of bounced back and forth, and that is one of the things that we like about Marquise Brown is the versatility. But yeah, you know, you're seeing late, like in the second half of the year, A dot in a single game, 19, 23 and a half, 38.5, 12, 22. So, I mean, we saw he's a more versatile player than I think people realize. And I think, you know, you talk about the short targets, I'm talking about the long targets. He can do both things, but you know, it's just the consistency hasn't been there for him. And you know, I was holding on to that 6 game sample with Kyler Murray when he first showed up in Arizona before getting injured. And we saw that like stretch where he was a wide receiver one, but he just hasn't recaptured that magic. He was a boom bust player when he was in Baltimore. We saw a little stretch of dominance when he was in Arizona. And since being in Kansas City, he's just reverted back to this boom bust player. So I don't know what type of market there's going to be for Marquise Brown, but my guess is he gets a 1 year contract, and we're talking about him this time a year from now, right?
Yeah, and that would be my expectation. So we are. I mean, it was really 2022 that was the last time that he was trending upward. He had played 12 games, had 700 yards in 12 games. Played 14 games the next year, 574 yards. Then we had the injury year last year, or 2 years ago, 24 now at this point. And then kind of last year played 16 games. But really, I mean, we're 3 full seasons removed from where we felt like Hollywood Brown was trending upwards. Going to be 29 this year. I mean, I'm giving up the GOAT here at this point on Hollywood Brown.
A guy that I'm not giving up the goat with is Christian Kirk. And I know he's heading into his age 30 season, but he's going to hit free agency now. What I like about Christian Kirk, I mean, like I liked him a lot when he was in Arizona. Another guy very similar to what we were just saying about with Marquise Brown, to kind of do it all. We saw in the air raid system with Cliff Kingsbury, like he was just running vertical routes, nothing else. And then later in his career at Arizona, he kind of became this slot player that was catching balls across the middle of the field, fighting through traffic. We saw him in Jacksonville emerging as their wide receiver one. And then this year, he got off to a slow start with the preseason hamstring injury, which happened like days before the season kicked off and seemed to hamper him for the majority of the season. But then we see in the playoffs when Nico Collins can't play, he is stepping up as their wide receiver one. So now he's 30 years old. But when I see him, I just see a resilient, versatile, adaptable player. And I know he's getting up there in age. That probably keeps him from getting that 4 or 5 year contract. But, you know, a 2 3 year deal to me, you know, we know that he can play in just about any offense. We know that he can move all across different formations. He can run every route in the book. This is a guy who probably isn't going to ever really be like a wide receiver one at this point in his career, but still has value in fantasy, I think, as kind of a guy that you can stream or flex on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I completely agree there. I was really in on him this summer coming into this year because I thought the opportunity was there for him to step up as the wide receiver two in Houston. Injuries really robbed that situation, but now maybe I don't know. I always say that once you start to get injured, it's Kobe Bryant talks about when he got hurt, and
Hmm.
he was fine up until that injury. When you're in your 30s and that injury happens, then you kind of just don't really bounce back from that. And I think that's kind of what we saw this past year with Christian Kirk. And so if you're counting on him to be fully healthy for a full season, something that really it would be really hard to count on at this point. But I think he's absolutely talented enough that, and teams might be desperate enough that he could land in a situation where we are. Jeff is talking himself in next summer again on Christian Kirk being the wide receiver two, the number two target earner on a decent team. But we'll see. I still like Christian Kirk. I completely agree with you there.
Yeah, and you talk about the injuries. He missed 5 games in 2023. He missed 9 games in 2024. He only missed 4 games in 2025, but they were at the start of the season. And then when he did return, he was still limited. They were trying to see what they had with the rookies as well. So it kind of took him until the playoffs to become a full time player in the offense and a starting receiver. So still going to assume that he has a few years left in the tank, and definitely not a guy that you want to be like dropping in Dynasty. Last guy that we have in this list, Jeff, veteran role players, Juju Smith Schuster. Probably not a guy that like needs to be rostered in every dynasty league at this point, but he's going to hit the market as a 29-year-old. And it's crazy, when this guy was younger, his time in Pittsburgh, we were looking at him as the overall wide receiver one in dynasty, was never really able to recapture that early season magic. But much like we were talking about with Romeo Doubs, probably a better real life football player than he is a fantasy asset at this point. I don't think that he's going to get this mega contract or anything like that, but I think he's a guy that, if he signs an $8 to $12 million contract, would surprise a lot of people. But I think that's about where his value should be.
Yeah, he in 2022 or not in 2018 when he was age 22, 1,400 yards, and that's when you're talking about when he was the dynasty wide receiver one, his second season coming out, 111
That's
catches, 1,400 yards,
Juju and
and he
Michael
was
Thomas at 1 and 2.
yeah, and then he was basically done after that.
Right.
It was just didn't really. And then there was the weird year in 2022 where he had 933 yards with the Chiefs. That just kind of like I feel like I know that I remember that happening, and but at the same time, it's like, did that actually happen? Like it's one that as you were to look back at Juju Smith-Schuster's stats and go year by year, that year kind of just stands out of nowhere. But he seems to be very beloved in Kansas City. Seems to like it in
Yeah.
Kansas City. Got a chance to get a ring in Kansas City, and can't say the same about Buffalo. But it's stay there, and I think that he tends to. There's probably got a good thing working for Juju Smith-Schuster. They kind of utilize him as that stand-in for Rasheed Rice, and I think Rasheed Rice got in trouble again. So maybe they're gonna have to keep Juju Schuster around to be that stand-in potentially.
That's what I was gonna say. You're basically like rostering Juju as like a handcuff to Rashi Rice, who's gonna give you like 60 to 70% of his production. Like on games where Rashi Rice is playing, you're getting nothing from Juju at all, but he does still kind of have that spot start appeal here and there. It feels like every year Rashi Rice goes down, gets suspended, something like that. Everyone picks up Juju Smith Schuster, starts him for a couple of weeks, and then back to the waiver wire he goes. So I'd expect him to stay in Kansas City, but we'll see how that shakes out. Now, we've got to talk about some big names here, Jeff. Big, big, big names, but very much so on the wrong side of the age curve. We could just lump all of these guys together. Mike Evans, Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins. Do you expect all of these guys to be playing somewhere in 2026, or we might be looking at some potential retirements here?
I just can't. I don't think Mike Evans is going to retire. I
He
don't think
won't.
Mike Evans
Yeah.
is going to retire, and I just cannot imagine him not being in Tampa Bay. It's one that I just cannot imagine him playing for somebody other than Tampa Bay at this point. And I think Keenan Allen's kind of at the point now where he basically would say, "I want to be a Charger. Otherwise, I'm fine retiring if I'm not going to be a Charger." And so we'll see what they. They're in a pretty good spot with wide receivers, depending on. I mean, they're going to definitely. I think they're going to keep Quentin Johnston around, and Lad McConkey. We know Lad McConkey, and then Trey Harris kind of growing his role a little bit, and Keandre Lambert Smith. We know kind of the buzz that he generated there, and so you're talking about your top four receivers feeling pretty good there. So I think that should they want to keep him around. But he did kind of transition last year into a little bit more of like the coach on the field with that wide
Mhm.
receiver room. And I think they very much valued that. I know the Chargers were a team that I covered last summer. And once they signed Keenan Allen, kind of a couple weeks into camp, it seemed to be everybody just kind of fell into place. Everybody felt a little bit calmer in the receiver room, and everybody was able to kind of enjoy their roles a little bit more with Keenan Allen there. And so I think Allen will be a Charger if he wants to be a Charger, and he will retire if the Chargers do not want him to be a Charger. Hopkins, I mean, you could say that DeAndre Hopkins is the interesting one, even though I feel like he's not interesting at all anymore at this point. It definitely feels like we are on the very tail end of his career. He wasn't thought we were in a good spot. Obviously, the injury to Lamar Jackson shadowed that a little bit. But when you're talking about he played with Lamar Jackson somewhat and then played with Patrick Mahomes the year before, and both opportunities looked like a shell of DeAndre Hopkins. You can't imagine a better landing spot than what he's kind of been in the last couple of years. And so I think we're kind of done with DeAndre Hopkins.
I feel like Buffalo would be the next logical step, right? Like he
I
couldn't do
don't
it in Kansas City,
no, I can't do it.
couldn't do it in Baltimore. Now he's going to go to Buffalo. I mean, it just feels like he's just like latching himself to all of these like young, unbelievable quarterbacks in hopes of getting a ring. But you talk about Keenan Allen, and I do think that you might be onto something there that he could stay there as just. I mean, he was a part-time player last year. Like played all 17 games, but played less than 70% of the snaps in 12 of those 17 games. Like he was far from a full-time player. He wasn't even starting at the end of the year. Like he was just kind of coming in, running some routes, every once in a while when they need to move the chains on third down, he'd come in. But like, I think that does make sense for him. And we saw it, like he did the 1 year in Chicago, went right back to Los Angeles. I think you're right. It would be either a Charger or retire. I kind of joked about DeAndre Hopkins in Buffalo, but I did a show with Theo Grebinger the other day, and we were talking about some potential offseason landing spots. And he is a big fan of Mike Evans in Buffalo. Jeff, how would you feel about that one as a Bills fan?
Yeah, I'd be thrilled with it. I still think Mike Evans very much has it in him, but again, I just cannot imagine Mike Evans being anywhere else. And
I know.
I'm not really sure if he should be in this category, if he should be in another category later, but I do see that you don't have Brandon Cooks on your sheet. And so that's
Mm.
another one that's kind of lingering out there a little bit that I don't know. He was obviously involved in two very, very large moments this past week, but he kind of did come in and be a decent supporting cast member for the Bills. I think that's another one kind of just on the very fringe of the radar that whether we really should have him on our dynasty rosters or not at this point, probably not, but you never know.
I really hope the Bills just do the right thing and find a way to move up in the draft and get themselves like a bona fide wide receiver one, or just open the checkbook and pay whatever it costs to get Alec Pierce. I think Alec Pierce in Buffalo is the perfect fit that we all really want here. He could be what they imagined Gabe Davis could be, but yeah, we don't need to talk about the Bills and fixing them going into 2026. We've got all offseason to talk
Let's
about
go
that.
get Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Everything's fixed.
All right, let's talk about some other guys here, Jeff. And like, this is very similar to the guys that we opened up the show talking about. We just kind of drew like an arbitrary talent line somewhere in here. These are also youngish players. Most of them are coming off of their rookie contracts. But these guys are like, we're the guys that we opened up the show talking about. George Pickens, Alec Pierce, Wan'Dale Robinson, Rasheed Shaheed, Jaylen Coker have answered questions about their talent level. Some of these guys still might have it, still kind of question marks as well. So let's start with John Mechie, because John Mechie is a guy, and let this just like be a lesson that sometimes when we just like write these guys off for dead after their first year or two of doing nothing in the NFL, these guys can show live like later in their careers and come back. And now John Mechie is a guy that, I wouldn't have expected any sort of buzz for John Mechie this offseason, but based on what we saw him do late in the year in New York, I expect there to be some sort of market for John Mechie right now, a guy that was just completely off the radar 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah, I think as you go through this entire list, you're really kind of just looking at guys that would be like wide receiver 3.5s in a rotation, basically, of those guys
Mhm.
that they're definitely not in your top two receivers, and you probably don't really know that you want them as your third receiver if you're going to play a lot of 11 personnel with three wide receiver sets. But you're kind of looking at depth. These are a lot of good depth options. We saw Yeah, Mechie had a little bit of run, decent run with the Jets, and I mean they did kind of just shift towards Adonai Mitchell being that guy, and we would expect probably Adonai Mitchell to get right now, absent of a massive addition, to be the chance to be the receiver opposite Garrett Wilson. Tyquan Thornton, we saw him have some big explosive plays when needed for the Chiefs. Yeah, they're kind of off the board here. I think for me, the most interesting one's probably Calvin Austin, just
Yeah.
because injuries early in his career, and then they kind of ran in last year with the Steelers to the point where he was definitely making plays, and Aaron Rodgers, I don't know, was able to find him in the areas that he was able to make plays. And you talk about some of these players that, I mean, if you were to land with a Lamar Jackson or with a Josh Allen like that, that could be an interesting one to me.
Yeah, one of my favorite stats, like in the, like when we're looking at like that small sample of the first like 4, 5, 6 weeks of the season, Calvin Austin was just like consistently top three in air yard share. And you look at it, it's like, Jackson Smith Najigba, Jamar Chase, Calvin Austin, and then like it just didn't make any sense at all until you think about how that offense functioned, that every single pass was 2 to 5 yards off the line of scrimmage, and then there would just be like two bombs a game that they would just rip downfield to Calvin Austin. So yes, a very good player and a Matt Waldman favorite, a guy who could draw some buzz this offseason. The guy that kind of jumps out to me as intriguing, Jeff, Tyquan Thornton. This was a second round pick, and we know the Patriots have not had luck with drafting and developing wide receivers. It was kind of weird to me how Tyquan Thornton was just pushed out of the picture late in the year in Kansas City, because we saw him operating at a very high level, and we know that he's a burner, but we also saw the hands, like not just making plays downfield, but also pulling in catches deep downfield as well. So this is also a guy still very young, just coming off his rookie contract, blazing speed, put some really good highlights on tape last year. He's another guy that I think a team out there, again, I keep going back to it, but it's probably the biggest need out there right now is a wide receiver one for the Bills, like Tyquan Thornton in Buffalo. Like I imagine you'd feel pretty good about that one. If you've got a burner who can catch the ball 65 yards downfield, like a lot of these guys that we're talking about, I'm just kind of wish casting into this Buffalo offense.
If Tyquan Thornton is the wide receiver one for the Bills, I'm not going to feel good about anything. So
not
I'll
the
just
not
say
the wide
that.
receiver one, but
You,
a tertiary
I get
piece.
it. I get it. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
adding pieces, yeah, sure. I'm there. I get it. I hear you. And I absolutely think that he played well enough to deserve a larger opportunity. And I think there are opportunities. You look around the league and potential opportunities that where he could. To me, I feel like the Saints, where like get him in a dome and like Tyler
Yeah.
Shuck and like send him deep like that. That was where I feel fun on Tyquan Thornton. Or even like a Detroit where, we saw, I mean, obviously Isaac Tisla is going to be the next big thing there, but we know that kind of the way that they unlocked Jameson Williams was
Mhm.
bringing him a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage and utilizing that speed sideline to sideline, and having Thornton kind of as that guy that could be the field stretcher there might be a fun one. I feel like I just wish casting Tyquan Thornton into a dome. I feel like that's where I want to like just throwing bombs into a dome.
Shades
Like
of Rasheed
find a
Shaheed.
team for find a team for Jameis Winston or Joe Milton to be the quarterback, and then have Tyquan Thornton out there and just throw it 70 yards and go.
So another interesting guy that we have on this list here, Jeff, is Jahan Dotson, former first round pick. And we saw like when AJ Brown or Devonta Smith was injured, he would step up and he could kind of play, but he was just buried behind two superstar receivers that he was just kind of out there running wind sprints. We know Jalen Hurts doesn't really want to push the ball deep downfield. Are we saying that Jahan Dotson, his time as a fantasy relevant receiver, because we got to remember, like a touchdown machine in Washington, his rookie season, hasn't really done much of anything since. But is this a guy that we should still keep a light on for, a guy who could potentially sign somewhere and surprise us with a contract and then become productive? And all of a sudden we're smacking ourselves in the head saying, duh, this guy's a first round pick who showed a lot that was just buried on a depth chart for the last 2 years.
Yeah, I kind of place him in the similar bucket as Jalen Naylor, where both of those
Mhm.
guys were kind of the clear third receiver in offenses that were not as good as the pieces indicated that they would be. But I know Dotson, he was very public about 2 years ago when they acquired him right before the season. He just really struggled to pick up the playbook and was just feeling behind the entire season. And then last year with Kevin Patullo, I mean, everybody was struggling with Kevin Patullo as the Eagles general or the Eagles offense coordinator. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking that there's a chance there with Dotson to step into a role somewhere. And, like I said, I put Jalen Naylor in that bucket there too, where we saw Naylor come in and make some plays as the
Mhm.
third wide receiver with the Vikings. I think both of those guys are, this whole tier is just like, it's kind of one of those of, I don't know that we even want to have them on our actual dynasty roster right now, but the opportunity for any of them to land in a position, like you said, like Buffalo, or like get them Tyquan Thornton in a dome, or like some of these fun things. Some of these guys could definitely emerge in this tier.
And I think what's going to happen is 2/3 of this tier. There are a few other names that we like didn't even mention that we had written down as we were prepping for the show. Greg Dortch, Sky Moore, Malachi Corley, some other like youngish guys that either have desirable athleticism or draft capital or pedigree. What's probably going to happen is like 2/3 of these guys are just going to be completely useless next year. But then one or two, maybe three guys from this year are going to sign a surprising contract with a team that has a need, and we're going to say like, "Ooh, all right, time to put our bids in for Calvin Austin or one of these guys." So it's really hard to guess who the guy is going to be, but these are all players who have shown flashes here and there that if they land in a situation that has opportunity, it shouldn't be ignored. Now, as we're kind of going through the whole picture of what this offseason is going to look like, we've got some other pending free agents who could potentially retire. Adam Thielen already announced his retirement, but looking at Sterling Shepard, Khalif Raymond, Zay Jones, Tyler Lockett, these are guys that might sign somewhere, might retire. But Jeff, of those guys that I just listed, Sterling Shepard, Khalif Raymond, Zay Jones, Tyler Lockett, are you rostering any of them in any dynasty leagues?
No, no,
All right.
I'm
All right.
out.
Just got to do our cleanup here. We got to at least talk about them.
Dave,
Their names.
we're almost through our list, and no Olamide Zacchaeus, a Dave favorite, and you
I
didn't mention
intentionally left him
him.
off. He dropped the ball so
You-
much this year. He is on my you know what list. I don't want to talk about Olamide Zacchaeus, but yes, also a free agent, and he might
Tim
sign
Patrick
somewhere to
is a
be
guy
a.
that just kind of ends up like in places like Tim Patrick doesn't, and T2 Atwell is going to
We,
be a free agent. You never know. T2 Atwell here. Let's see what
he got
else
$10
we have
million
on
dollars
this.
last year. I think that was kind of a
I did
thank you
get
for your
$10 million
service
last year.
contract, but he did
Yes.
get $10 million last year. Let's talk about the fun stuff here, Jeff. We've talked about well, not all, but most of the free agents, the guys that we expect to be, somewhat um, just relevant, maybe. Let's talk about some of the trade candidates. This is where we can get weird and just start guessing about some stuff. AJ Brown, speaking of weird vibes in Philly. I don't know what's going on here. Like he has made it sound like he wants to leave Philadelphia. It sounds like he doesn't like Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts all that much. There's just this like weird constant tension in the Philadelphia locker room. And we have heard rumors about the Buffalo Bills potentially being interested, the New England Patriots potentially being interested. Do you think that AJ Brown is a Philadelphia Eagle next year?
I did really enjoy the clip of, like, I think it was after the Buffalo game when Nick Sirianni like did something in the hall and AJ Brown was like kind of right behind him, and AJ Brown gave him like a little bit of like, what is this clown doing? Like it's you definitely feel like, yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know. It's certainly been put out there. He definitely was not as bad as I think a lot of the perception around him, and I think people realized that kind of in the middle of the year that it wasn't quite as bad as we thought it was going. But he is. We run into these guys. He's not To. But like you get those little vibes of like some of these receivers of they end up playing for multiple teams throughout their career.
And I think that is spot on. Yeah, just a guy like a Brandon Marshall is another one that comes to mind. Who are some other? I know we just had this conversation in season when it was something like Devontae Adams had caught double-digit touchdowns for his third team, and we were, like, looking at all of the other guys, and they were all guys that, like, I think head case is a little bit too harsh, but all guys that had a personality, and that's what constantly, like, they'd kind of overstay their welcome after, like, 3 or 4 years with a team and move on to a new team, and I feel like that's kind of just where we're at with A.J. Brown at this point, and my guess is that wherever he gets traded to, whether it's Buffalo, New England, maybe even back to Tennessee, who is desperate for a wide receiver to put around their QB1, like, wherever he goes, my guess is that after a trade, we would see a highly motivated and invigorated AJ Brown playing like he did early in his time in Tennessee and early in his time in Philadelphia. But it just doesn't seem like he wants to be a part of the Philadelphia team anymore.
Yeah, I mean Stephon Diggs is another one of those players where it's
Yes.
and like like these guys are, I think they're intelligent guys. Like I think AJ Brown's
Right.
an intelligent, introspective guy. It's just that sometimes an intelligent guy like that is like maybe just is not going to put up with the BS at some level. Maybe that's the reason why, but I don't know.
Let's talk about another trade candidate here, and this is probably a pretty obvious one, DJ Moore. We saw how the Bears season ended. It was kind of funny. The Bears season was bookended by week one. We saw that like DJ Moore giving up on a route, and there was all of that discussion on social media. Like, was it a bad throw from Caleb Williams or was it a bad route by DJ Moore? We ended up finding out that DJ Moore kind of gave up on the route, and then that just so happens to be what ended the season. Now we have DJ Moore's agent coming out and kind of spin control here, saying that he picked up a concussion on the second to last play of the game, and that's why he didn't finalize his or finish his route. But then we also just get like weird stuff. Everybody like this was as crazy as it sounds, coming out of that loss for the Bears, it was a moral victory. Like they are way ahead of schedule. Caleb Williams made some spectacular plays. They hung in there with the Rams, and like everybody still felt good in the locker room. Like they were saying the right things at the post-game press conference. DJ Moore was nowhere to be seen. The day after that loss, the locker room cleanout day when everybody's in there, DJ Moore still nowhere to be seen. So we kind of talked about it last offseason that DJ Moore, some of the effort was waning a little bit. We saw him walking off the field and sitting on the bench in the middle of a live play. And then this year we see, in between some of these lack of effort plays, we also see game-winning highlights, like the catch over Keyshawn Nixon against the Packers, and the catch that Caleb Williams dropped in a bucket in the back corner of the end zone that looked like the catch from San Francisco. I mean, like there are good moments here, but the consistency just hasn't been there. My expectation is that they probably shop DJ Moore this offseason. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I think I mean, we know Ben Johnson was basically talking about DJ Moore without talking about DJ Moore, like when he took the job and talking about effort with players. And you talk about the concussion. I think DJ Moore was concussed way earlier in that game. There was that window where he was in the blue tent for a long time and kind of came back. And then, like, the next play after he came back, hit his head again. He's kind of down on the sideline a little bit and then came back in the game. I think he was concussed way before the second to last play of
If
the
not
game.
concussed, I mean, at least hurting, and that is like I do not want to question DJ Moore's toughness. This dude played through so many injuries this year. Like the way he catches balls across the middle of the field that just get him blown up consistently. And like, was it the Washington game? I know there was a game that he played and he was clearly like ailing through the game, just struggling badly. And then as soon as the
Well,
game ended, gets like an ambulance ride to the hospital. Like that is it has been a tough season for DJ Moore. I don't want to take that away from him.
yeah, it was the Washington game. He went to the hospital after the
Right.
Washington game. Yeah, it was, and there was some weird stories about that. But yeah, I think and again, I don't think it's quite the same level of AJ Brown, but I do definitely think it's just that Ben Johnson is Ben Johnson, and Ben Johnson's very particular about where his wide receivers need to be and what they're doing. And I think that DJ Moore has probably outstayed his welcome in Chicago.
Yeah. The kind of joke going around Bears Twitter right now is that DJ Moore just finally ended up on a winning team and just didn't know how to act. He never been in that position before and just kind of short circuited a little bit. But let's keep talking about some potential. And actually, I want to say the last thing on DJ Moore, Max Crosby for DJ Moore just addresses both needs that both teams need. The Bears are desperate for an edge rusher. The Raiders are desperate for a wide receiver that can play opposite Brock Bowers. Just please make it happen. All right. Next guy we want to talk about, potential trade candidate here, Jeff, Brian Thomas Jr. We have been talking about Brian Thomas Jr. getting traded since like week 3. I just don't think he's a good fit in Liam Cohen's offense. I think that when you look at what they are trying to do, a Jacoby Myers and Travis Hunter duo is exactly what they're trying to do. Like I can see that being the Mike Evans, Chris Godwin type of duo, and asking for versatility from the receivers, asking for a full route tree, asking to catch balls across the middle of the field. That's not what Brian Thomas Jr. does. Now, that's not to say he's not a good receiver. I just think it was a square peg in a round hole situation. I think if they put him out on the trade block, a lot of teams would be very, very interested. So I'm going to say it again, Jeff. Brian Thomas Jr., a Buffalo Bill, would that get you excited?
Yeah, I would be very excited about Brian Thomas Jr. I mean, that's the guy that I want to go out there and get, and that's the guy that everybody should want to go out there and get. Here's the conspiracy theory time of Howie Roseman makes big moves. Howie
Mhm.
Roseman is a thinker. Howie Roseman likes to put pieces in place. Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, Jaden Daniels, all very, very tight. And like, couldn't you just see Howie Roseman like somehow parlaying AJ Brown not wanting to be in Philadelphia anymore into Brian Thomas Jr. and then starting to plant the seeds to undermine the division teams with like putting some pieces in place, like get some Malik Neighbors do the Saquon Barkley and pulls him out of the Giants. Then all of a sudden you're sitting there saying, Jaden Daniels, you really want to sit here in Washington? We come right over here. We're just a quick train right up here. You can go over to Philadelphia and be thrown to your guys here, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. And that's my grand conspiracy theory of the wide receiver trade out.
I think that would be fun. It might take years to pull off, and I don't know if it would actually happen, but I think that just a more simplistic version would be the Eagles potentially moving on from AJ Brown and then trading for Brian Thomas Jr. like the very next day. And I could see that just like, what is Jalen Hurts going to do? Like, Devonta Smith can't be a wide receiver one. And then 18 hours later, the Eagles go trade for Brian Thomas Jr. I think that
Yeah.
would make a lot more sense. They get some money off the books, they get a little bit younger, and they get a motivated guy who can come in and play a similar role to AJ Brown. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Buffalo makes a lot of sense, as I said earlier. But I think what we did learn this year is that Brian Thomas Jr. is not just a plug and play wide receiver one. He is a guy who, if he's in the right situation, if he's got the right quarterback, he can be very, very good. But let's just go ahead and have like the full blown Brian Thomas Jr. conversation here, Jeff. Do you get any sort of Jahan Dotson vibes where like Jahan Dotson, first round pick, all of these touchdowns his rookie season, just big play after big play, and then just kind of evaporated after that? Are we starting to look at, potentially what we saw? Because it wasn't even like a full season of big play from Ryan Thomas Jr. It's just kind of them playing garbage time late in the season with Mac Jones. Outside of that little like 6 game stint at the end of his rookie season, it has been very volatile production from Ryan Thomas.
I know I get it. I think no, because I think Jahan Dotson, he kind of was overdrafted, and I don't think physically he was exactly a first round type of wide receiver. And even like it was more ended up in like the right place at the right time type touchdowns his rookie season.
Right.
Whereas like I think Brian Thomas Jr. might be the like one of the, if not the very best athlete at wide receiver in the NFL. Like he's like that good of an athlete, and he is an absolute space cadet. And I think that I know Brian Kelly was, prior to his big season in LSU, there was some stuff about Brian Kelly. It was basically Brian Thomas was driving Brian Kelly crazy at LSU, and then I really think that via Jaden Daniels and Link Neighbors and the tragic story with Kyron Lacey, but like I really think that there was a lot there with like those guys pulling it out of Brian Thomas Jr. And I mean, if I were the Giants, like that's the team that I would be looking at potentially going out and getting Brian Thomas Jr. because we talk about Wan'Dale
Yeah.
Robinson moving out, like going out and reconnecting him with Malik Neighbors, and then kind of you got Jackson Dart, you're feeling good there, or Washington needs a wide receiver, so like go out and get Brian Thomas and bring him back with Jaden Daniels, because I do think that Malik Neighbors and Jaden Daniels were kind of the center point of bringing the best out of Brian Thomas Jr. And so I think he's definitely a very much a player that needs to be in the very right environment. I think that what we saw that rookie season, it was just like the season was lost. You had Mac Jones. Mac Jones is saying, screw it, I'm just going to throw it up to Brian Thomas Jr., or it would be like an out basically in a broken tackle, but in a way that only Brian Thomas Jr., very few players would be capable of doing in the NFL and on those touchdowns. And that's where I separate from Jahan Dotson. But then I think coming into year two and Liam Cohen, and I mean, you probably maybe a little bit of the Ben Johnson type of the, like, you need to do this, you need to be doing these things. And it definitely early in the season seemed to be very much in Brian Thomas Jr.'s head on that. We know that awful game against Cincinnati where he had multiple drops, and then
Right.
they just kind of basically said, all right, we're gonna go here with go out and go Jacoby Myers, and we need to play Parker Washington more. And that's I think those things that happened there with Brian Thomas Jr. But I think the places that I would feel most best, I would love to get him in Buffalo and kind of see if you can
And
develop him there.
let me
But
just kind of segue into another potential trade candidate,
yeah,
Keon Coleman. there's been a lot of Keon Coleman trade buzz. I mean, like, what would it take for Keon Coleman to swap with Jacksonville? Like, hey, you guys try to figure Keon Coleman out. We'll take on Brian Thomas Jr. I'd imagine that Buffalo would probably have to give up a little bit more than
I think they would have
they'd
to give up a
be
lot more, to be honest. I think
a
that the
lot more.
view
Yeah,
around on Keon Coleman is a bust around the
yeah.
NFL, and I think it would probably have to be a first round pick to get Brian Thomas or something of that range to get Brian Thomas Jr.
Now let's talk about some of the potential releases here, Jeff. And I've been scouring contracts all day, trying to find the guys who could potentially end up getting released this year. I think the most obvious one is Tyreek Hill. $52 million dollars would have to be his salary next year. They can eat $28 million in dead cap if they move on to him. So $14 million in cap savings coming off the dislocated knee. My guess is that Tyreek Hill is no longer a part of the Miami Dolphins. Um, does it just make too much sense for him to just go back to Kansas City at this point?
I hear the argument. I think that there might be some feelings there on that one.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I think Kansas City probably feels Kansas City probably has to feel like they got out on Tyreek Hill at the exact right
Yeah,
time. I
fair,
mean,
fair.
there was some good seasons in Miami, but they probably have to feel like that. To me, I know the Rams were kind of around there, but I think that they feel good about Devontae Adams potentially. If the 49ers, if the pieces kind of fall right for the 49ers, that feels like one where Kyle Shanahan might say like, and then he would have some insight. I don't know where the relationship with Tyreek Hill and Mike McDaniel like ended up, but like he would have some insight there. Or at the same time, we're kind of at the Raider territory of the career. Like we're kind of in like the Raider Brown territory of the career with Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw the news, Jeff. As we were recording, we just saw Mike McDaniel signed with the Chargers to be their offensive coordinator. So a team that is flush with wide receivers right now. I don't think we're going to be looking at any Mike McDaniel, Tyreek Hill reunion there. But let's talk about another guy who could potentially get released. And we talked about him way earlier in the show, but Michael Pittman owed $29 million next year, but they set it up where they could just eat $5 million in dead cap. So they'd be saving $24 million if they choose to move on. Now, I think you're probably right, Jeff, that he is just too good of a player. We don't see this. What is he, 28, 29 years old? These players typically don't just get flat out released. But my guess is that they would shop him on the trade market, and that if they can't, for whatever reason, get something in return, they do kind of have that out that they could just release him. I mean, when we're looking at the salary cap here, they're not tight by any means, but $34 million above the or below the salary cap right now. So they're very much so middle of the pack. If they want to extend Daniel Jones or do some of these other things that we've talked about on other shows, they might have to find ways to get creative with it. So I frankly, I don't expect Michael Pittman to be a Colt next year, whether he is traded or released. I'm not sure, but it seems like they set this contract up and the moves that they have made in the draft over the last couple of years. To me, it seems like they are, very intentionally trying to set up for a post Michael Pittman team.
Yeah, and we've talked about AJ Brown, DJ Moore. I mean Tyreek Hill, like some conversations with some guys that they're out there a little bit, and I feel like Michael Pittman is the exact opposite. I feel like Michael Pittman is a consummate professional, like team leader, like the type of guy that
Yeah.
I know. Like 2 years ago, when 2024, when he had that back injury, it was basically like a galvanizing point for the Colts. Of the locker room saw what he was going through to be able to be active, and so I think that if you're talking about the argument of like, well, what are we getting into getting this guy, like to me, like Pittman's like none of that at all. It's the complete other direction. And I mean, maybe there'd be something around like an AJ Brown for Michael Pittman, given that Sirianni and Shane Steichen, they know each other
Yeah.
very, very well. And maybe that could be a
AJ
proxy
Brown's
for.
best years were with Steichen as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the money going to Alec Pierce potentially might prevent that. But that's where I think that's kind of where I see on Pittman, where like some of these other guys that you're like, oh, what are you getting into here? Like that's where you end up. Maybe you have to eat the money and cut him. Whereas I think Pittman's the opposite of like this guy's going to come in and he's going to be a leader. He's going to be professional. We feel really good about the person that we're coming out and acquiring.
Calvin Ridley coming off of a down season, in between injuries, of course, but he's going into his age 32 year now. They structured his contract so they could save $13.8 million by releasing him. Jeff, there's almost no chance that Calvin Ridley is a Tennessee Titan in 2026, right?
I mean, all the things that I just said about Michael Pittman, and then we go and talk about Calvin Ridley. So,
Right.
I mean,
So yeah, I think we could just kind of gloss over that one. Calvin Ridley going to hit the market, but as a 32-year-old, quite a ways removed from. Well, he was okay in 2024, but it's kind of been two really good seasons sprinkled in between a bunch of injuries. I don't think anybody's breaking the bank for Calvin Ridley. Now, another interesting one, Jeff, and I haven't seen many people talking about this, but I remember we talked about Devontae Adams when he first signed that contract in Los Angeles, saying this is kind of just like a glorified 1 year deal. Like they set it up that they can get out from under Devontae Adams next year if they want to. They'd save $14 million in cap if they move on from him. Now, the Rams, they're always doing creative things with their salary cap. And it's funny, we talked about them being in like salary cap hell just a few years ago. And now here they are sitting with $60 million available, a bunch of good, talented players on rookie deals and budget friendly contracts. So they don't need to get rid of Devontae Adams, but we talk about Terrence Ferguson, a guy that they have hopes for. We talk about some of these rookies coming in, and they have 2 first-round picks as well. They might just sit on Devontae Adams because they can afford to, but if they get to a point where they can be in the running for an Alec Pierce or an AJ Brown trade or something like that, they could move on from Devontae Adams pretty effortlessly.
I feel like we never really get to have like the real football conversation because we kind of tend to do like talk about the players and the fantasy and all that. But like from the football side of it, I think Devontae Adams unlocks so much with the Rams
Yeah.
offense in terms of the way that they were structured, having to kind of account for Cooper Cup or like Cooper Cup was just very limited towards the end of his career, what they had to do there. And I think that we talked about we mentioned Tutu Atwell or like a guy like Jordan Whittington, like some of these guys that are very limited and very scheme specific in what they offer at wide receiver. Whereas Devontae Adams comes in and he can be anything. And so because he can be anything, now Puka Nacua can be anything. And all of a sudden you
Mhm.
got two receivers out here that can be anything. And that's where it opens up the Rams being able to play a lot more 12 personnel, a lot more two tight ends out there on the field for them and being able to have these different looks. And so I think Devontae Adams just unlocks so many different things. Keontae Mumfield, if he's available in your deep dynasty league, that's a guy that I would be adding because I think that he is very much in the similar mold of a guy that can be these versatile receivers. But I think Devontae Adams, that flip from Cooper Kupp to Devontae Adams, I think just unlocked so much. And I think Sean McVay, he's not going to want to give that up.
I think you could be onto something there, absolutely. And I think like I said, it just comes down to like if they have any better options that they can get and they need to get creative. Like they set it up so they could get out from under this contract, but he is very valuable to the team. You talk about Kanata Mumfield, I'm going to say Terrence Ferguson, a guy that I'm still going to hold it down for that started to come on a little bit stronger late in the year, has been involved throughout
Yeah,
the
they like
playoffs as
Ferguson.
well. Yeah, I think he is also a guy that we'll see take a big step forward next year. You mentioned Cooper Cup, another guy who we see the 2 year headline, but very much so a 1 year contract. They could save $9.5 million moving on from Cooper Cup, especially if Clint Kubiak leaves. I would expect them to move on from Cooper Cup, who's kind of playing like this weird hybrid slot receiver slash tight end role right now. Do you think Cooper Cup's part of their plans next year, Jeff, or do you think they probably just release him and move on?
I think that they probably move on and he will land somewhere in the Shanahan McVay tree, basically, because he's a coach on the field, more or less. And that's what he was with Clint Kubiak and Sam Darnold coming in there. So that's kind of my expectation on Cup.
Darnell Mooney, they can move on and save about $7.5 million if they so choose to. We talked about this on a show a couple of weeks ago. I think that it is going to be a priority for the Falcons to retain Kyle Pitts, who is also a free agent after this year. And I think that trying to get money wherever they can is something that they are going to be trying to do. Definitely not hurting for salary cap right now. They've got about $28 million to spend, but if they can add to that to open up the bank for Kyle Pitts, I'd expect them to do so. Jeff, another guy that we fully expected to get released after his first year, Stephon Diggs. This was the one like we see the 3 year, $69 million contract. Everyone loses their mind. What are you doing paying that much money to an older receiver? But they can save quite a bit of money if they move on from him. I just realized that I have the wrong numbers in my notes here, but looking it up real quickly, if they move on from him after this year, or if they retain him next year, they'd owe him $28 million. If they release him, they save $20 million, eating just $8 million in dead cap. So to me, that tells me that Stephon Diggs is probably not going to be a Patriot next year, but I just don't see them, given where they are, like wanting to pay a 33-year-old wide receiver $28 million.
Yeah, they do structure these contracts kind of as a 1 year deal with a second year balloon on it. But I mean, Diggs has been phenomenal for the
He
Patriots.
has been.
I definitely said some things last summer that I was wrong about, but he's been a really good find for them and has helped them. It's really kind of, but what's Stephon Diggs going to decide? Because he's one of those guys.
Right, and there will be a long off season where I'm sure Stephon Diggs will have a lot of TMZ rumors that we'll be paying attention to and dissecting as well. So that, I mean, I can understand kind of the Devontae Adams argument that he made, where like having that wide receiver one opens up everything else, and like Kayshon Boutte and Demario Douglas and Hunter Henry may not have done what they did this year if it weren't for Stephon Diggs. But this is one where, again, like maybe they just try to get younger, go for a different player. We'll see how that shakes out. A couple of other, the last guy we could mention here, Brandon Ayuk. We know that his guarantees were voided. They can release him, and they'd still have to deal with the accounting portion of this $29.5 million in dead cap if they release him. But they don't owe him any money, and they want to be on the hook for the future years as well. So I've heard that he's a potential trade candidate. They could just flat out release him. I don't know what's going to happen here, Jeff, but I would be willing to bet that Brandon Ayuk probably never plays for the 49ers again.
It's shout out to Bill Simmons. I don't know if it's still the Tyson zone, but Brandon Ayuk firmly is in the. There could be any headline that could come out about Brandon Ayuk tomorrow, and we would immediately believe that it was true. And that's where we're landing with Brandon Ayuk. But he's a heck of a deal in Dynasty right now if you've got the stomach for it.
Brandon Ayuk driving past the 49ers facility
Anything.
right after 90 miles an hour, like
Brandon Ayuk has
videotaping
nuked the power plant next to the 49ers practice facility.
it. Well, that'll do it. There was a lot to talk about, man. Wide receivers are, we talk about the running back show. There were a lot of guys to talk about. And well, the wide receivers, it might not be like the marquee names up top when you start digging into these contracts and looking at the releases and whatnot. There is a lot to discuss. So as always, want to thank y'all so much for taking the time to tune in. Jeff and I will be back next week to talk about some rookies as we are getting ready to release version 1 of the rookie guide, as well as some tight end previews. So thank you so much for taking the time to tune in, and we will see you next week.